The sun scorched the relentless Arizona desert, where the heat shimmered on the horizon like a restless mirage. The dry wind carried dust over the steel tracks, humming a dull, eerie tune in the vast silence. In the middle of that endless landscape, a cruel scene unfolded. Winslow, a chestnut thoroughbred, lay chained to the railroad tracks. His broad chest heaved with labored breaths, his deep brown eyes reflecting the terror of an inevitable fate creeping closer with every passing second. His legs were tightly bound by rough iron chains, his hooves scraping helplessly against the gravel. The veins along his muscular neck bulged from the desperate struggle. But strength was slipping away. In the distance, the shrill whistle of an approaching train tore through the still air like a thunderclap. Perched on a nearby hill, a man watched. Silas Rourke, a hardened rancher, stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his steely eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a worn-out leather hat. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Winslow had been nothing but trouble, a wild, defiant creature that had thrown his rider during a race, leaving his youngest son, Emery, with a broken leg. To Silas, this was not just revenge, it was a lesson. A beast like Winslow needed to learn its place. But he was not alone. On the other side of the tracks, hidden behind a patch of dry sagebrush, a girl watched with a pounding heart. Ivy Calloway was no more than 17, but she had seen enough of the world to recognize cruelty when it stared her in the face. Raised among the horses on her grandmother's ranch, she knew Winslow was not the villain Silas believed him to be. He did not deserve this. The train loomed closer, its black smoke curling into the sky like a dark omen. Ivy swallowed hard. If she hesitated another second, it would be too late. She ran. Ivy's heart pounded in her chest as her boots dug into the loose gravel, sending small stones scattering in her wake. The heat pressed down on her skin, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. The train's whistle screamed again, closer this time. The ground trembled beneath her feet, the vibrations of the approaching locomotive sending a jolt of panic through her veins. Winslow's ears flicked toward the sound of her footsteps. His large, dark eyes locked onto hers, wide with fear but also something else, trust. He wasn't thrashing wildly anymore. He wasn't pulling at the chains in vain. It was as if he knew. He knew she had come for him. But Ivy had seconds. Maybe less. She dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers trembling as she reached for the rusted chains binding his front legs. They were thick, heavy, and cruelly tight. Someone had wanted to make sure he couldn't move, not even to struggle. Her stomach twisted with rage. Silas! She knew the man well enough. The Rourke family had owned land just beyond her grandmother's ranch for generations, but their reputation was anything but kind. She had heard the stories. Silas Rourke was a man who saw animals as tools, disposable and replaceable. And if one of them cost him something, an injury, an inconvenience, a damaged ego, he made them pay. Winslow had paid the price for a mistake that wasn't his fault. Ivy's fingers worked frantically at the chains, her nails scraping against metal, her arms burning as she pulled with all her strength. The steel links barely budged. Her throat tightened in frustration. She needed something, anything, to break them. She whipped her head around, scanning the ground, her mind racing. A rock. A sharp edge. Anything she could use to pry the lock loose. But there was nothing. Only dust, gravel, and the relentless, steady roar of the approaching train. A desperate whinny broke through her thoughts. Winslow shifted beneath her, his muscles coiling like a spring. He wasn't giving up, but he needed her help. No. Ivy clenched her teeth, her mind screaming for a solution. Then, suddenly, a spark of hope. Her knife. Her fingers flew to the leather sheath on her belt, yanking the small blade free. It wasn't much, just a hunting knife she had carried since childhood, but it was sharp. With a burst of adrenaline, she wedged the tip into the chain's rusted padlock, gritting her teeth as she twisted with all her strength. The lock groaned. A second twist. The whistle blasted, deafening now. The rails shook violently beneath them. The train was almost there. Ivy let out a sharp cry as the blade finally caught hold, forcing the lock to snap open with a metallic clank. The chains loosened just enough for Winslow to react. His powerful legs kicked free, dirt flying as he scrambled to his feet. But there was no time to celebrate. The train's headlamp bore down on them, a blinding orb of white-hot light. Ivy barely had time to react before Winslow lunged forward, his body slamming into hers. The world spun. The deafening roar of the train filled her ears. And then, darkness. A deafening roar. A blinding flash. The screech of steel on steel. Then, silence. Ivy's world was dark, heavy. A crushing weight pinned her to the ground, her body half buried in dust and gravel. Her ears rang violently, muffling the distant hum of the train's fading wheels. She could barely think. Was she dead? No. Pain flooded her senses, sharp and immediate. Her ribs ached. Her head throbbed. There was dirt in her mouth, the taste of blood on her tongue. Slowly, she forced her eyes open. Blue sky. A single hawk circled above, gliding in lazy loops. The sun glared down, merciless as ever. She was alive. But what about Winslow? A strangled gasp left her throat as she twisted onto her side, ignoring the searing pain in her limbs. Her eyes darted across the tracks, desperate, and then she saw him. Winslow stood just a few feet away. His powerful chest rose and fell in heavy breaths, his coat slick with sweat and dust. His legs trembled, but he was standing. Alive. Ivy's body sagged with relief, her heart hammering against her ribs. They had made it. But how? Then it came back to her. The moment before impact. Winslow had moved first. Just as the train barreled toward them, he had lunged, not away, but toward her. He had knocked her clear off the tracks, using the last ounce of his strength to push her to safety. He had saved her. She let out a shaky breath, struggling to her knees. "Good boy," she rasped, her throat raw. "You're okay." Winslow's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but he didn't move. Something was wrong. Ivy pushed herself upright, her body screaming in protest. She took a step forward, then froze. Blood. A dark trail of crimson trickled down Winslow's front leg, pooling into the dirt beneath him. His right hind leg was bent at an unnatural angle, a deep gash running along his flank. He had escaped death, but not unscathed. "No," Ivy whispered, her vision blurring. This wasn't fair. He had fought so hard. He didn't deserve this. She reached out, pressing a hand gently to his neck. His skin twitched beneath her touch, his body tense with pain, but he didn't pull away. He trusted her. He had always trusted her. But trust wouldn't save him now. She glanced toward the horizon, her stomach knotting. They were in the middle of the desert, miles from town. No one was coming. Unless... Her heart clenched. There was only one person close enough to help. Silas Rourke. The very man who had left Winslow to die. Ivy's blood ran cold at the thought. She had spent years hating him, hearing the stories of his cruelty. Asking him for help felt like signing a deal with the devil. But if she didn't, Winslow wouldn't survive. Her fingers curled into fists. There was no choice. Taking one last steadying breath, she looked Winslow in the eye. "Stay with me," she whispered. Then, with one final glance at the bleeding horse beside her, Ivy turned and ran toward the man who had nearly killed him. Ivy ran like her life depended on it. Maybe it did. The heat burned her skin, sweat dripping into her eyes as she sprinted up the dry hillside. Her boots slipped on loose gravel, her breath coming in ragged gulps, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, Winslow let out a low, pained whinny. The sound sent a fresh wave of urgency through her veins. He was hurt, badly. If she didn't get help soon, he wouldn't make it. But the only person close enough to help was the very man who had left him to die. Silas Rourke. Ivy spotted him near the edge of the hill, standing with his arms crossed, watching the dust settle over the train tracks. Like a vulture. He didn't flinch at the near tragedy he had orchestrated. Didn't run to see if Winslow had survived. He just stood there, chewing on a toothpick, as if he had simply lost a bet. Rage burned through her, hot and fast. But rage wouldn't save Winslow. She forced her fists to unclench as she reached the top of the hill, stopping just a few feet away. Silas turned to face her. "Well, well." His voice was slow, like molasses, thick with amusement. "Didn't think you'd be fool enough to come running my way, Calloway." Ivy's chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. "He's hurt," she said, her voice raw. "His leg, he's bleeding. He needs a vet. Now." Silas didn't move. Didn't blink. His gray-blue eyes flicked lazily past her, scanning the desert below until he found what he was looking for. Winslow. Standing weakly near the tracks, sides heaving, blood trickling into the dirt. The old rancher let out a quiet chuckle. "Would you look at that?" He shook his head, clicking his tongue. "Tough bastard." Ivy's stomach turned. Silas wasn't impressed. He was mocking him. She stepped forward, her hands shaking. "Please," she said, swallowing her pride. "You have a truck. A trailer. I just need to get him back to town." Silas finally looked at her, tilting his head slightly. "And why the hell would I do that?" Ivy's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Silas wasn't a man who gave without taking. "You hate that horse," she said, her voice steadier now. "You wanted him dead. Fine. But if you leave him out here to bleed to death, people will know. My grandmother. The sheriff. Hell, even your own son. You really want Emery knowing you chained a horse to the tracks and watched him die?" For the first time, Silas's smirk faltered. Emery. Silas's youngest son had always been different from his father. Kind where Silas was cruel, soft-spoken where Silas was sharp. He had loved Winslow, even after the accident that shattered his leg. Ivy pressed on. "You think Emery will forgive you for this?" she asked, voice razor-sharp. "Because I don't." Silas let out a slow exhale, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. For the first time, doubt flickered behind his eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I'll take the horse," he said. Relief nearly knocked Ivy off her feet. But then, Silas smiled. "But it ain't free," he added. "You want me to save that horse? Fine. But he's mine now." The words hit Ivy like a slap. No. She had fought for him. Risked her life for him. And now, Silas wanted to own him? Her hands trembled at her sides. Her breath hitched. Every part of her wanted to scream, to fight, to say no. But then, Winslow whinnied. Weak. Desperate. She closed her eyes, her chest tightening. She had no choice. Ivy swallowed hard. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke the words that sealed her fate. "Deal." Ivy's stomach twisted as the word left her lips. Deal. It felt like betrayal, like she had just signed away Winslow's soul. But there was no other choice. If she refused, he would bleed out in the dirt, alone. She wouldn't let that happen. Silas gave a slow nod, the smirk never leaving his face. Without another word, he turned and strode toward his truck, boots kicking up dust. Ivy followed, every step feeling heavier than the last. She hated him. Hated that he was the one with the power. Hated that Winslow's life now belonged to a man who had tried to kill him. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Winslow lay weak in the trailer, his breathing shallow. Ivy sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the dry, endless land. The Rourke Ranch loomed ahead, a place she had only ever seen from a distance. Now, it would be Winslow's prison. When they arrived, Silas pulled the truck to a stop and hopped out, barking orders at the ranch hands. "Get him in the barn. Patch him up." Ivy rushed to Winslow's side, brushing her fingers over his coat. He was still warm, still alive. But when they lifted him, he didn't fight. He had no strength left. As the men led Winslow away, Silas turned to Ivy. His expression was unreadable, but his next words sent a chill through her. "You want to make sure he's treated right? Then you'd better stick around." She stiffened. "What?" Silas leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "You care so damn much about that horse? Fine. You work for me now. You wanna keep him safe? Then you'll do what I say." Ivy's blood ran cold. She had saved Winslow's life, but at what cost? Ivy felt the weight of Silas's words settle over her like a storm cloud. "You work for me now." The desert heat suddenly felt suffocating, the air too thick to breathe. She had come here to save Winslow, but in doing so, she had trapped herself. Her jaw clenched. "That wasn't the deal," she said, her voice tight with anger. "You said you'd take him in. You never said anything about—" Silas cut her off with a low chuckle. "I said he's mine. And if you want to make sure he stays in one piece, you'll do what I tell you." He leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "Or you can walk away. See how long he lasts without you." Ivy's nails dug into her palms. Every part of her wanted to fight back, to scream that she would find another way. But the truth was, she wouldn't. Winslow needed care, now. And without her watching over him, Silas had no reason to keep him alive. She turned toward the barn, ignoring the smug look on his face. Inside, the ranch hands were already tending to Winslow. His injured leg had been wrapped in bandages, his breathing still labored but steady. Ivy knelt beside him, brushing her fingers over his sweat-dampened coat. "I won't leave you," she whispered. She stayed by his side long after the sun dipped below the horizon. The sounds of the ranch faded into the distance. Men talking, horses shifting in their stalls. The scent of hay and earth filled the air, grounding her. For the first time in hours, she let herself breathe. Winslow was alive. That was all that mattered. But deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't just saved him. She had given herself up, too. And Silas Rourke wasn't the kind of man to let go of something he owned. The barn was quiet, the dim glow of a lantern casting long shadows over the wooden beams. The scent of hay mixed with the metallic tang of blood, a grim reminder of how close Ivy had come to losing Winslow. She sat beside him in the stall, legs tucked beneath her, her fingers tracing absent circles over his bandaged leg. His breathing was slow but steady now, his body no longer trembling with shock. He was alive, but at what cost? Her own freedom had been the price. Outside, the sounds of the Rourke Ranch carried through the night, muffled voices of ranch hands finishing their shifts, the occasional whinny of a restless horse. But in the barn, it was just her and Winslow. She had stayed long after the men left, refusing to move until she was sure he would make it through the night. He had saved her life on the tracks. She owed him everything. The creak of the barn door sent her heart into her throat. Silas! His heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor as he stepped inside, stopping just outside Winslow's stall. He didn't speak at first, just observed, his sharp eyes flicking from the injured horse to the girl kneeling beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice was unreadable. "You're gonna wear yourself out sitting here all night." Ivy didn't look at him. "I'm not leaving him." Silas let out a quiet hum, as if considering her words. "You're stubborn. I'll give you that." He leaned against the stall door, his posture casual, but Ivy wasn't fooled. He was studying her, testing her. She finally lifted her head to meet his gaze. "I want to be the one taking care of him. No one else." A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You think I trust my best stall hand to some girl who's never worked a day on this ranch?" "I grew up breaking horses," Ivy shot back. "I know how to care for them better than any of your men." Silas chuckled, shaking his head. "Confidence won't get you far here, Calloway. Hard work will." His eyes darkened slightly. "You wanna stay by that horse's side? Fine. But you work for me now. And that means you don't just look after him. You pull your weight." Ivy's fists clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "Then tell me what I have to do." Silas studied her for another long moment, then pushed himself off the stall door. "Be in the stables at dawn. You'll do everything the other hands do. No special treatment." He took a step back, his expression hardening. "And if you so much as step out of line, I send that horse to auction. You understand me?" The threat hit her like a slap. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "I understand." Silas lingered a moment longer, then turned and walked away, the barn door slamming shut behind him. Ivy exhaled slowly, pressing her forehead against Winslow's warm coat. The weight of exhaustion threatened to pull her under, but she couldn't sleep. Not yet. Because now, she wasn't just fighting for Winslow's survival. She was fighting for his future. And she had just stepped into enemy territory. The first light of dawn painted the sky in muted shades of gold and pink, but there was no beauty in it for Ivy. As the rooster crowed from somewhere near the main house, she was already pulling on her worn leather boots, her muscles aching from a night spent on the hard barn floor beside Winslow. Her new reality had begun. She glanced at Winslow, who was still resting, his chestnut coat rising and falling with steady breaths. The bandage around his hind leg was clean, but the wound beneath it was deep. He would need time, something she wasn't sure Silas would give him. A sharp voice cut through the morning stillness. "Move it, Calloway. Ain't got all day." Ivy turned to see Gunner Tate, one of Silas's ranch hands, standing in the barn doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his jawline. She had heard his name before, a man who did whatever Silas asked, no questions. She squared her shoulders and walked toward him, refusing to let him see even a flicker of hesitation. "Where do you need me?" Gunner smirked. "Feisty. Let's see how long that lasts." He tossed her a pitchfork. "You start with the stalls. Then you'll be breaking the colts." Ivy's fingers tightened around the wooden handle. Cleaning stalls was one thing, but breaking colts? That was dangerous work, especially on this ranch. Silas bred fast, high-strung thoroughbreds, and if you didn't handle them right, they'd throw you before you even got a foot in the stirrup. Still, she kept her expression blank. Fine. She got to work, muscles burning as she shoveled old hay, replaced water buckets, and hauled heavy sacks of feed. The other ranch hands barely acknowledged her, except for the occasional glance or muttered remark. To them, she was just another worker, except she wasn't. She was a prisoner. By midday, the sun was relentless, and sweat dripped down her back as she made her way toward the training corral. A small group of cowboys stood along the fence, watching as a young stallion bucked wildly, fighting against the reins of the man trying to break him. Silas stood nearby, arms crossed. When he spotted Ivy, he motioned her over. "Your turn." Ivy hesitated for the first time. She wasn't afraid of horses. She had broken plenty before. But these weren't the horses from her grandmother's ranch. These were Silas's. And he didn't raise them to be gentle. Still, she couldn't refuse. She climbed into the saddle, gripping the reins just as the stallion exploded beneath her. A jolt of power surged through her body as the horse twisted and kicked, trying to throw her. She clenched her legs tighter, her fingers steady on the reins. This was where she belonged, on horseback, in control. Silas watched, eyes narrowed. The other ranch hands muttered in surprise as Ivy stayed on, her body moving fluidly with the horse's rhythm. After a few minutes, the stallion stopped fighting, his wild breaths calming. Silas's lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile. "Not bad, Calloway." But before she could respond, he added, "Let's see how you do tomorrow. If you last that long." Ivy didn't flinch, because no matter what Silas threw at her, she wasn't leaving. Winslow was counting on her. The days on the Rourke Ranch blurred into a relentless cycle of exhaustion. Ivy woke before dawn, worked until her hands bled, and fell asleep beside Winslow in the barn each night, too sore to move. Every muscle in her body screamed, but she refused to break. Because if she broke, Winslow had no one. Silas tested her at every turn. Harder tasks, longer hours, more dangerous horses. But no matter how much dirt she ate or how many bruises bloomed beneath her skin, she got back up. She always got back up. And that was starting to get under his skin. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the desert, Ivy stood by Winslow's stall, brushing his coat with slow, deliberate strokes. His wound was healing, but he still couldn't put full weight on his injured leg. Every day, she prayed it would be strong enough before Silas lost his patience. "Still clinging to that horse?" Ivy turned, already knowing the voice. "Gunner." He leaned against the stall door, a smug smirk on his scarred face. "Ain't no way Silas lets you keep him forever, you know. Best not get too attached." Her fingers curled around the brush. "I'm not letting him end up in some slaughter pen." Gunner let out a low chuckle. "Slaughter pen? Hell, Calloway, that ain't the worst that could happen." His smirk widened. "Some folks out here like their horses broken. Really broken." Ivy's stomach turned to ice. He was toying with her, pushing her to see if she'd crack. She forced her voice to stay level. "What do you want, Gunner?" He stepped closer, close enough for her to smell the tobacco on his breath. "I wanna know what you're really doing here. Girl like you don't belong on this ranch. So tell me, Calloway, what's your plan?" Ivy's heart pounded. She didn't have a plan. She had been surviving on instinct, one day at a time. But now, the walls were closing in. Winslow's leg was healing, but not fast enough. Silas's patience was running thin. And if she didn't do something soon, she might lose him forever. That night, as she lay in the straw beside Winslow, the truth settled over her like a weight. She couldn't wait anymore. She had to get him out. Tomorrow night, they were leaving. The desert night stretched endlessly before her, the stars flickering like whispered promises against the dark sky. Ivy crouched beside Winslow's stall, heart hammering as she listened for any sign of movement outside. The ranch was quiet, most of the hands asleep after a long day's work. But Silas never truly slept. She pressed a hand against Winslow's warm neck. His breathing was steady, his injured leg stronger than it had been days ago, but not strong enough for a long run. They didn't have a choice. If they stayed, Silas would break them both. "Easy, boy," she whispered as she unlatched the stall. Winslow flicked an ear but didn't hesitate as she led him out, his steps careful on the dirt floor. Every creak of the old barn sounded too loud, every breath like a shout in the silence. Ivy swallowed hard and kept moving. The ranch gates were just ahead. Almost there. Then, a voice like a gunshot in the dark. "Going somewhere, Calloway?" Ivy froze. Silas stood near the fence, arms crossed, a slow smirk spreading across his face. The lantern beside him cast deep shadows over his weathered features. He had been waiting. Her grip tightened on Winslow's lead rope. "Let me take him." Silas chuckled, shaking his head. "You really think I'd let you just walk out of here?" His gaze flicked to Winslow. "That horse is mine." "No," Ivy said, voice steady. "He was never yours." Silas's smirk faded. His hand twitched toward the revolver strapped to his hip. "You best think real careful about your next move, girl." A cold rush of fear prickled Ivy's skin, but she didn't back down. "If you shoot, it'll wake the whole damn ranch. You ready to explain why you gunned down a girl over a horse?" Silas's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Winslow did. With a sudden surge of strength, he reared up, his front hooves slicing through the air. Silas cursed and stumbled back, hands flying up to protect his face. Ivy didn't hesitate. "Run, Winslow!" she shouted, slapping his flank. The horse bolted through the open gates, his powerful legs carrying him into the night. Ivy turned to follow. A hand snatched her wrist. Silas's grip was like iron. "You ain't going anywhere," he growled. Ivy didn't think. She swung her fist, catching him square in the jaw. Silas cursed, his grip loosening just enough for her to rip free. She sprinted after Winslow, her lungs burning, her legs moving before her mind could catch up. The desert swallowed them whole, the ranch fading behind her. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the cool earth. Ahead of her, Winslow stood waiting, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers. He had never left her behind, and she had never left him. A shaky breath left Ivy's lips. They had done it. They were free. And no one, not even Silas Rourke, would ever take that away.